Thank you for coming, everybody. It's been great to have the opportunity to do an in-person SWAN lecture for the first time since 2019. It's been a couple of years of Zoom webinars, and it's nice to have the opportunity to hear from somebody in person. So I want to thank you all for coming today. My name is Sarah Duke, and I am the curator of popular and applied graphic art in the Prints and Photographs division here of the Library of Congress. I've been here for a good long time, and I've gotten to see a lot of scholars over the years, but it's only since my former colleague Martha Kennedy retired in 2021 that I've had the privilege of working directly with SWAN Fellows and getting to see how they use our caricature and cartoon collections, and it's a real privilege. The Prints and Photographs division is the sponsor of today's program, and we have been the sponsor of the Swan Foundation Fellowship for 25 years. The foundation was formed in Manhattan in the 1980s to fund scholarship in caricature and cartoon in any field, as well as to provide access through exhibition and preservation. The Swan Foundation Fellowship is offered to scholars in any field. There is no limit. We offer up to $5,000 per individual. Every applicant submits a budget, and the board reviews their budget and decides how much to allot. The fellowship does come with a mandatory 2 weeks residency at the Library of Congress, and selected fellows are given the opportunity to give an in-person presentation or a Zoom presentation now that we're in the third decade of the 21st century. And I just want to say that today's event is being recorded. If you ask Monica a question after her presentation, you are automatically giving your consent to being part of the future webcast. And there is a microphone over here to my left for you to use right here by the second row, for you to use in posing your question to Monica. Dr. Monica Hahn earned her PhD in art history from the Tyler School at Temple University, where she now serves as an adjunct professor as well as a professor at Philadelphia Community College. In 2020, what an auspicious year, she was awarded a Swan Fellowship for her project, Harlequins of Empire, Staging Native Identity in British Imperial Art circa 1776. She has been very patient with us. We didn't open to researchers until July of 2021, by which time her fellowship was nearly over. So we both agreed to extend her fellowship for another year. And I must say, for me, it's been worth the wait. I hope it's been worth the wait for you as well. It's been great fun watching her these 2 weeks work her way through the collection as she excitedly finds things that we don't describe well enough for her to locate through our online catalog. So it's the pleasure of doing the deep dive into our collections that brings new information to light. Dr. Hahn was invited to give a lecture on her work in progress. And today she is going to talk about, and I'm going to hope I pronounce this correctly, the peregrination of Harlequin Mungo, Jamaican performances of race in the 18th century British Empire. And without further ado, I invite Dr. Hahn to come and give her presentation.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm so pleased to be here and to speak to you about my research project in general, and then specifically what I've been working on this summer and during my time here at the Library of Congress as a Swan Fellow. I'd like to start with a look at this early 19th century game because it demonstrates the expressions of British empire building in the late 18th and early 19th centuries and its view of the world. Geographical Recreation, or A Voyage Round the Habitable Globe, is a colorfully illustrated English board game published by John Harris in London in 1809. 2 or more players move their markers around the board's 4 quadrants, each of which represents a distinct corner of the globe. Europe at the top, Asia to the left, and then at the bottom, the Americas, and then on the right, Africa. A look at the representations of the different nations in the habitable globe reveals much about the way British audiences perceived the ideal relationship between themselves and the rest of the world. Europe is personified as a woman seated atop the globe, while representations of the other 3 continents are grouped deferentially at her feet. The ostensible subject here is the conquest and trade between Europe and the rest of the world. Europe holds up a sword and is framed by a billowing ship's sail as each of the other continents offers up as tribute gifts from her native land. America, a stalk of maize, Asia, precious gemstones, and Africa, an ivory tusk. In this representation, the real individuals with whom Europe traded and communicated are reduced to an accommodating cast of generic characters. A spin of a teetotum, which is a kind of a die. It's a object that has numbers on the sides, but it's not a proper die because dies were associated with gambling. So for children's toys or other toys, a die would be inappropriate. So this kind of spinning top called a teetotum was used for popular games. So the spin of this teetotum advances the player's marker around the game, around the game board by continent. First Europe, followed by Asia, the Americas, and then Africa. The first player to return to Europe after this trip around the world is the winner. In studying this game and other objects and actors in my project, my methodological and critical intervention asks, what if you don't follow the rules? I'm drawn to objects and people that allow and even invite rule breaking in order to discover the possibilities of subversion or transgression of the expected social order. While I do consider high or fine art, such as large oil paintings in my project, I'm really most interested in print culture and ephemeral objects like this one. I'm showing here a collage of a few of these objects here that express some of the case studies in my book project before I move into the main body of my talk. So briefly, for example, on the upper left there, this rare movable book called a turn-up book because the flaps turn up. And these types of metamorphic books were innovated by Robert Sayer in London in the 1770s. And so one could go to the local print shop, buy 2 large prints that fit over each other. The top print would be cut horizontally and then in 3 vertical cuts and pasted to the bottom print at the top and the bottom so that one could turn up and down these flaps after one has folded it into this accordion style and then could turn the pages. And some amusing transformations would take place as one turned these flaps up and down, and those moves would be indicated on the print itself, which should go up and down in what order. This book itself has as its subject the 1762 Cherokee delegation to London to meet with King George to reaffirm a peace treaty that the 2 sides had signed in America in 1761, and it chronicles the Cherokees' movements about London at that time. But some very interesting and subversive things happen if the reader doesn't follow the printed instructions. And I can talk about that later if you have questions about it. And this type of book is also sometimes called a harlequinade, and that's a term derived from the theater, and I'll return to the importance of theater and especially harlequinades to my project a little bit later. Another remarkable object is the object at the bottom, geography game. I'm only aware of 5 existing copies of this game that was sold in the early 19th century in London. Which is contained in this beautiful mahogany box with this elaborate printed cover. The cover slides off, and inside the box are cut out a number of figures, backdrops, and characters that then could be slotted into the reverse side of the cover, which could be slid back onto the box, and could set up scenes from different people and locations around the world. And here from the advertisement for this very object. The panorama represents scenery, costume, etc. of Arabia, Hindustan, the frozen ocean, Italy, Kamchatka, Tahiti, Lapland, and Turkey, with a book of directions. The whole contained in a neat mahogany box with a splendid emblematical title. And in my book project, I examine representations of the South Pacific and its residents, especially Society Islanders and the famous Rayatian Omai, whom some of you may have heard about, who returned to London with Captain Cook's second circumnavigation of the globe. And he was famously portrayed in a large oil portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds, one of the preeminent portraitists in London in the second half of the 18th century. Again, while there's an instruction manual that directs the player how to set up the scenes, there is the opportunity, or perhaps even the invitation, to disrupt the expected relationships among places, people, and identity, as one could mix and match, perhaps, these scenes. And finally, this unique model set on the upper right, designed by Royal Academy member Philip de Loutherbourg, who's perhaps better remembered for his dramatic maritime paintings. The setting of this set piece is the Pacific Northwest, but it's for a play called Omai, and in fact named after the Omai I just mentioned, who South Pacific Islander, Rayatian native who Captain Cook brought back to London. And I'm happy to talk about that play if you're interested at the end, but I wanted to mention briefly what the type of play this Omai play was. It was a pantomime play, and pantomimes were a kind of afterpiece, as they were called in the British theater. So when one would go to the theater, there was not just one play, there was a whole evening's worth of material, perhaps beginning with a concert or a dance, and then there would come the main piece, the proper tragedy or the proper comedy, which then would be followed by an afterpiece. And an afterpiece might be a pantomime play, it might be a harlequinade, as I'll talk about in just a moment, or it might be another dance and some hornpipes to wrap up the evening on a high note. But I'll tell you just for now that the pantomime afterpiece of Omai has as its subject an indigenous person who becomes a rule breaker, as I'll mention in another play in just a moment. But my current research is about Jamaica and its relationship globally and specifically within British empire building and the colonial project and the project of slavery at the time. I just began work on this part of my project this summer. It's exciting and fresh to me, and it's, again, what I'm researching here as a Swan Fellow at the Library of Congress. So I want to begin with this interesting object. It's a tea canister. It's two sides of the same tea canister, and it's was designed for storing tea leaves. You're likely well aware of the importance of tea culture in Britain in the 18th century and onward. And the practice of preparing tea at this time was that it was not prepared in the kitchen and then brought out to guests and family. In fact, it was prepared in front of guests and family in the parlor or in some other more public space. And so the tea canister would be part of that ritual of making and preparing tea. And these tea canisters were often very decorative. They also, of course, signified the status and the wealth of the person who owned these objects. And the tea would be prepared by the lady of the house, often with the help of a servant. So I became very intrigued with the figure of the young black man behind the lady at the tea table that's depicted on this tea canister. The website at the Victoria and Albert Museum describes him as a servant, but there were at this time many enslaved people in London. And in fact, there were between 10 and 20,000 black servants in London in 1750, many of them who were enslaved and not paid servants. And many of these were brought to London, in fact, from the West Indies and not directly from Africa. And this figure on this tea canister looked so familiar to me, and for a long time I couldn't place why he looked so familiar to me. Well, in fact, because he's been lifted directly from a print from many decades earlier by William Hogarth, very famous British satirist in the earlier part of the 17th century. And in fact, it's from plate 2 of a 6-plate series that was called The Harlot's Progress. The series showed the story of a young woman, Moll Hackabout was her name, who arrives to London from the country as an innocent country girl, and she very soon succumbs to the evils of the underbelly of London, becomes a sex worker, becomes a kind of kept wife by a wealthy merchant, and then inevitably falls further and dies in the end. Very tragic story which Hogarth manages to satirize of the current state of social affairs in London. So here in plate 2, she's married a wealthy merchant, and we see them here in their parlor. She's seated there in a chair of prominence, a very wealthy interior, expensive wallpapers, large-scale oil paintings on the background, and the young black man has come in with a tea kettle to assist in preparing tea, and yet just at that moment, Moll has created a diversion and upset the mahogany table to divert her husband from the fact that in the background her lover, her maidservant, is spiriting her lover out of the door just in time, and which has occasioned her upsetting the table. We as viewers are meant to surmise that this wealthy merchant has earned his wealth in the British colonies. The mahogany table, mahogany is indigenous to the Americas, so that the wood for that table would have come from colonies in the West Indies. The servant or enslaved person himself also would have come from the West Indies. The other lavish, the fancy tea set, the pet monkey, all of these details indicate that he's made his fortune in the British colonies. And as we'll see, those Britons who became wealthy abroad were often regarded with suspicion upon their return to London. The Library of Congress has a few imprints of this series from later editions in its collection. This Hogarth series was sold by subscription. It was immensely popular, and in fact so much so that other printers plagiarized those prints to get in on the popularity of the action. And Hogarth himself was instrumental in advocating for the Engravers Copyright Act of 1735, which gave protection to producers of engravings. Prior to that, other printers would just copy existing engravings, and often one can tell because they're in the reverse, because they were copying onto the copper plate what they saw in front of them, so that the print taken from that would then be in reverse. Several decades after Hogarth's The Harlot's Progress, Isaac Bickerstaff penned a play with a similar plot, and it was called The Padlock. And it was an afterpiece. Not all afterpieces were pantomimes. There are a number of different kinds of afterpieces, as I'll talk about in just a moment. The music was written by Charles Dibdin, who was also an actor, and he played a principal role. He played the role of Mungo, who was a West Indian slave to the cruel husband Don Diego, who keeps his bride Leonora locked up, hence the title, The Padlock. And this a print of the play script is here in the Library of Congress collections in the rare book collections. But Leonora manages to take a lover anyway, which seems often to be the case here. Dibdin played the part of Mungo in blackface and as a stereotype, as musical, drunk, greedy servant speaking in an approximation of a Black Island dialect. At the same time, it's Mungo himself who helps effect the liaison between Leonora and her paramour by rejecting his duty or loyalty to Don Diego. Dibdin's Mungo was immensely popular, and the play itself also was very popular, and it was staged dozens of times in the 18th and the 19th century. It was the last known time that it was played on the stage was 1843, nearly a century after it was first staged. The famous American actor Ira Aldridge was the first Black man to play the role of Mungo in 1826, and so prior to that, all of the actors who portrayed Mungo did so in blackface. Well, the tea caddy that I showed earlier displayed a narrative scene with a figure borrowed from a very dramatic series of prints. This pair of tea caddies, which has only recently come to my attention, show quite literally actors in their theatrical roles. So we see on the left Mr. Moody in the character of Simon in Harlequin's Invasion, and on the right Mr. and Mrs. Barry in Venice Preserved. And so here we see the relationship between print culture, stage plays, and these kind of elite objects as a very strong one. And the figure of Dibdin as Mungo is very difficult to see in this photograph, is in the left tea caddy on that side that one can barely see. And here I'll show you a, not a better photograph, but a better view of what you can only see sort of obliquely on the left tea caddy. There's Charles Dibdin as Mungo, and that's taken from this popular print at the time. Within a decade, there was a spin-off of The Padlock, and in this case, it was a pantomime harlequinade. Harlequinades, as I've just hinted at before, are a specific type of pantomime afterpiece, and they all pretty much take the same standard plot with standard characters. There's the figure of Harlequin, who's the protagonist, the hero who pines after Columbine, whom he's espied from afar. They're star-crossed lovers. They want to be together, and there's always a character who stands in their way, usually Columbine's father, sometimes a character called Pantaloon. And Harlequin and Columbine hatch a plot so that they can be together, they escape, and then a mad pursuit follows with lots of foibles and comedies, but in the end they always manage to get together despite the best efforts of her father and often his sidekick, Clown, so that they get married at the end. The harlequinade characters often engaged in improvisational slapstick and physical comedy. In fact, Harlequin has a magic bat with which he can transform things, and that's in fact where slapstick comes from, because the bat had a hinged piece of wood on it, and so when he touched something to transform it, there was a slap, and that's where slapstick originates. So these characters function as kind of stereotypical stylized representations with whom audience members could identify, and whose actions usually had the intention of collapsing the distinction of high and low culture. For example, among the standard plot lines in these pantomimes was the ability of Harlequin to transform a character, or even himself, into another character. So for instance, a queen into a servant, or an old woman into a judge. And these pantomimes, harlequinade pantomimes, regularly featured satire and were farces that mocked social conventions and hierarchies by modifying the stock plot to address issues of the day. So Harlequin not only breaks the rules, but he also has subversive powers to upend the status quo, but always within this familiar plotline of forbidden romance, chase, and reunion and marriage. In Harlequin Mungo, Mungo is again a West Indian enslaved person treated very poorly on a plantation. And one night, while he laments his situation, ready to commit suicide, a wizard appears and transforms him into Harlequin Mungo. And he immediately assumes all the characteristics of the traditional Harlequin character, including falling in love with and eloping with the white Columbine, who is a planter's daughter. Their whirlwind pursuit takes them from the West Indies magically across the ocean and all around London, and then back to Jamaica. At the end, at the end of their interracial marriage, at the end of the play, their interracial marriage is endorsed by her father in a decided subversion of cultural and societal expectations. Another work that evinces a kind of slippage of race and power is the fictionalized memoir of Jeremiah Grant, born in Jamaica, called The Peregrinations of Jeremiah Grant, Esquire, the West Indian. People of British extraction, but who were born in the West Indies, were called Creole at the time. Creoles were regarded as suspicious by European-born Britons, just as those who derived their wealth in the colonies and returned to live in Britain were. Jeremiah's father is English, born in England. His mother is Creole, born to English parents, but born in Jamaica. And because she was raised among Black Jamaican wet nurses, she's described as having, quote-unquote, Negroish habits. Jeremiah goes to London for an education among other Creoles, which even historically was something that took place, that the English planters would send their children to London to be educated and then return to the West Indies, the British West Indian colonies, Jamaica and Barbados. So he goes to London for an education among other Creoles, and his schoolmaster is contemptuous of the lot of them. He says, quote unquote, "It is no wonder that you Creoles are thieves and robbers. You are all descended of felons and rebels." After adventures and misadventures in England, Jeremiah returns briefly to Jamaica, where he makes money through questionable business practices, and returns to London, both with goods to sell and with the mixed race Dulcinea. He remarks that both Dulcinea and he were, quote, likewise a Numidian hue, unquote. So her Numidian hue from her mixed race heritage, and Jeremiah's presumably from his time in the Caribbean sun. And the Londoners they encounter stare at the brown-skinned couple traveling in the countryside and in the city, and are surprised at how well Jeremiah speaks English. Here again, identity and even race become unstable categories as colonial life produces protagonists with slippery social and cultural status. What does it mean to be Harlequin Mungo, this rule-breaking, enslaved person with the agency to subvert the social order? I don't mean at all to suggest that the very real atrocities perpetrated on enslaved people were something that they might change the way Harlequin Mungo could. What I do suggest is that it reveals a British anxiety about the sustainability of slavery and Britain's ability to maintain control. The visual narrative and stage representations of the Black body provide a place for experimenting with alternative realities, social, racial, moral. And it might change the way we view images such as this one, in which a black-faced Harlequin comes to an assembly at Whitehall to deliver the news of the death of William Beckford, the mayor of London, born in Jamaica, grandson of the governor of Jamaica, whose wealth was built on the forced labor of enslaved people. Or this print in the Library of Congress collection, ostensibly meant to satirize the outrageous fashions and extravagances of the day. The ladies' enormous wigs, the menagerie of domestic and exotic animals are made to appear ridiculous. I suggest that the social critique is only augmented by the presence of the Black youth in the print. The racialized body takes on the ability to exact judgment precisely because of its unstable nature as essentially other. And the anxiety that this notion produced in the British was worked out on the stage, in tea caddies, in literature, and at the print shop, in what we might call the peregrinations of Harlequin Mungo. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. I'm told to ask you, please, to ask them at the microphone.
Hello, my name is Dana Scherer. I work at Congressional Research here in the library, and I've been just recently studying copyright and in both the U.S. and Europe and the history of that. So, and I know that, I think in England, sometimes even if publishers didn't have copyright, like they would get like an exclusive license from the king to publish, but then in exchange the king had to approve of the content. Could you explain a little bit about the flow of money, like how people made money, and also were these goods and prints, were they then, did they flow into the U.S. because there was no international copyright back then? So U.S. publishers can make a lot of money by not paying British creators for any of their works.
Sure, absolutely, as much as I can. As I so yes, these prints, especially those that were sold by subscription, the artist and the print seller would enter into an agreement, and so that the print seller would agree to publish these prints and would take then subscriptions for this. People would pay for the print. Often, even before the prints were finished, they would pay for a run of prints. And so in that way, the artist would be paid, the printmaker would make a profit in this way. And yes, there were types of prints that were endorsed by the crown, and those often have a kind of line that indicates that at the bottom of the print. The prints did make their way around, not just into the United States, or America at the time, but even around the world. And I've seen some really interesting examples in which, by the turn of the 19th century, there were so many English prints and some American prints, in fact, as well, in China, that Chinese artists would copy them into reverse glass painting. So there's this really interesting movement of these images around the globe, often unauthorized and often just outright copied.
I'd love to ask you a bit about your research. I mean, it's such interesting themes and ideas, and Sarah referenced a little bit the difficulty of finding things in the collections, and I mean, many of these ideas and even terms would be hard for us to know looking at the object unless you were doing that level of research. So what were some of the frustrations you hit, and what did you use, and what ideas or areas to find what you found, and where did you have successes? And
sure, happy to. That's been really exciting.
Yeah.
Been really exciting. Yeah. So, as you may have noticed from my book title and also here in this presentation, this character of Harlequin is centered to my research and to my suggestions about how these objects work. And this character, this stock stage character, who has the ability to disrupt things, transform things that don't suit him, and then who inevitably, it seems, makes an appearance as an indigenous person on the stage. There's Harlequin Cherokee, Harlequin Mungo, but there's also Harlequin Eskimo, Harlequin Indian from India. So that figure of Harlequin is really central in my research. And so in doing keyword searches for Harlequin, certainly some things come up, but what's been really exciting is that finding things that don't come up in that way. And so I've been working with the collection of prints that are called PC2 and PC3, which are part of a large purchase made by the library in the 1920s, sold by King George V at that time. Six. But in any case, what's remarkable about this collection of prints is that they are prints that by that time had not yet been owned by the British Museum, and most of which are still not owned by the British Museum, which is by far, of course, the largest collection of British prints. So this means, and many of them have not yet been digitized. So that means they have a catalog entry here in the Library of Congress and a title, but not a full description of everything that's there. So I've been just having a wonderful time looking literally at every print, one by one, and have in fact found several appearances of Harlequin in these prints that I wouldn't have known about had I not seen them. And a couple of them are there on the table if you have time to look at them afterwards. So that's been really the most exciting thing about my stay here so far, is finding harlequins in unexpected places.
Have you noticed harlequin in Junkanoo, in Jamaican Junkanoo?
Yes.
And also the role of Anansi as a change agent and,
Yes.
you know, somebody who changes everything and is subversive.
Yes. Yes. So many cultural traditions, literary, oral, storytelling traditions have a trickster figure in them, and I think Anansi, of course, is one, but there are others as well. And so Harlequin does play a very similar kind of role as these trickster figures in other traditions. And Junkanoo, which is a celebration in Jamaica, which has a long and interesting tradition in which it was a time in which the enslaved people put on elaborate costumes and danced to music in Kingston and in other places, a tradition which continues actually to this day, but took place in the 18th century, in which the people dressed in very elaborate costumes. I haven't yet seen a Junkanoo harlequin with that traditional lozenge shape, but the kind of elaborate dress certainly has some similarities to that kind of costuming and making kind of slippages of race, because in these Junkanoo parades there was often a kind of satire of the planters in those processions. So again, that kind of blurring of the boundaries by these non-white actors.
Obviously, as a print curator, I'm curious about the afterlife of prints. And so the Harlequin Cherokee, have you seen anything similar in the prints and photographs division where we haven't cut them apart, but they were meant to interact with each other?
Yes, I haven't. As you might imagine, because they were cheap and because they were meant to be manipulated, not many survive. And so I've seen several Harlequin Cherokees. There's one at the Beinecke Library at Yale. There's one in Princeton. Where have I seen the other one? It's escaping me now. I've seen three. So they don't survive very readily, again, because as with the game, objects that are meant to be used and played with often don't stand the test of time. But I haven't, in the prints I've looked at, I haven't come across one of those before.
So with that fold-out sheet that you said, if you folded it incorrectly, subversive things happened. Can you tell us what happened?
Sure, of course. Maybe I can go back to that slide. So for instance, so what you're looking at, right, on the left is the book closed, and then I've sort of accordioned out and lifted a flap just to demonstrate how it looks. But one would read it like a book and flap the pages up and down and then turn. And just for instance, on that cover page, so the intended order to turn those pages, to turn the top flap up first and then the bottom flap afterward. And in that, so there's the Cherokee Ostinako. He was the head of the embassy. There he is, standing at Temple Bar, and in front of him are a woman selling apples and her child. When one turns the top flap up, his upper body becomes the upper body of Harlequin with the lozenge pattern and everything. And when you flap the bottom flap down, then the rest of Harlequin appears. And so interestingly, and this is interesting even when one turns them in the correct order, the tomahawk that Ostinako is holding there in his hand becomes Harley's bat. And so this symbol of, for the English, this symbol of aggression and savagery becomes the actual object with which this transformations can take place. But, and then when the bottom flap is opened, Harlequin appears there, but instead of the apple seller and her son, the other two members of the delegation appear. But if one turns them out of order, and one turns the bottom flap down first, now there are no English people in Temple Bar, there are only Cherokees in Temple Bar. And that's a kind of interesting notion that the English disappear and the Cherokee become the most prominent characters. And there are other examples such as that in the book, but that's my favorite one.
So knowing that you're focused on British prints specifically, but the printing culture was all about trading and sharing and iconography, have you ventured into other printmaking cultures, or by strings being pulled to find what you're looking for, noticed any influences of Harlequin in other European countries specifically, but more broadly around the world?
Yeah, so I mean, I do obviously study mostly British prints, but there are prints from France, primarily from France, that then were republished in London. So I have looked at some of those. Harlequin does not appear to be as important a character in those other countries, although the Harlequinade and that kind of plot derives directly from Italian Commedia dell'arte, but really became massively popular in Britain in the 18th century, where it really in Italy had been popular in earlier centuries.
So I think you mentioned about the Harlequin Mongol sort of being a symbol of subversion in British eyes, and it almost sort of project anxiety of the society as to whether their colonialism sustainable.
Right.
So can you elaborate a little more? Because I was trying to figure out that direct connection there. Thank you.
Sure, and it relates back to the popularity or the standard plot of Harlequinades themselves. And there are plenty of them that don't feature indigenous characters, where it might be the critique of the British prison system, where suddenly Harlequin appears and he lets all the prisoners with his magic bat, transforms all the prisoners into free people. And so it was a way in which, in a kind of safe place of the stage, to exact critique on the way things are going. And so I suggest that the fact that Harlequin Mungo, as an enslaved person or on the stage as a white actor in blackface, is able to disrupt those expectations. So the fact that Harlequin Mungo marries Columbine, which according to the plot has to be so, but it becomes very jarring and strange that union is then endorsed on the stage. And I think that in that way, the British playwrights are able to work out those anxieties and as I say, kind of imagine a different future, not one perhaps that they themselves desire, but a way for them to imagine that possibility, which then in turn I think reflects a kind of insecurity about that should be the intended future. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure sharing my research with you. Thanks for your attention.